pressed an ear to the door. 30 seconds. A minute. Then 5. The difference between movies and real life is that in real life, I couldn't leave my place. I had to wait it out. There was no line or moment beyond which I felt safe, not after that vivid sound. And I didn't dare open the door. There are probably some who think I'm a coward, not realizing what a moment like that truly feels like. It was almost 20 minutes before I moved back to my bed and sat on the edge of it. My cell phone was on the night table, charging. I reached for it and held it in one hand, muting it so there would be no ringtone if someone were to call or text me. Unlikely in any case. One more sound, and I would make the call to the police. Not for a second did I doubt what I'd heard. All that was uncertain was what had caused it. I had no pets. The outer doors were all firmly locked, or so I hoped. There were 2 remote possibilities that I could accept. One, that the house was settling somehow due to some recent unpredictable weather, and 2, that Kristen had somehow come back into the house. But why? Why would she do that? I crossed the room and looked out the window. Only my car was in the driveway. In the end, it was anticlimactic. Just me sitting back on the edge of my bed for so long that my eyes began to close and I was drawn into sleep. I lay on top of the blankets, clutching that cell phone, and I awoke to sunlight pouring in my window. Even then, I'm ashamed to say it took some time to work up the nerve to open the bedroom door. I made 2 calls to coworkers before I did, and one to Kristen, and worked into the conversation what had happened the night before. Before I left for work, I turned the TV on loud with the intention of keeping it on all day while I was gone, and then I very reluctantly went down into our finished basement. I didn't check around too much, getting a bit nervous down there. Heading out, I realized that my front door was unlocked. I must have left it that way when I'd been making trips in and out with the groceries. And so I was pushed even more toward making an awful conclusion. Everybody at the office got the story from me that day, just to make myself feel better, really. But when I got home a little before dark, my mood soured completely. How was I supposed to go in there alone and just drop off to sleep like nothing had happened? I sort of hated the people at work who had just listened to my story and empathized emptily. One of them even made light of it. I wished they could know what it was like to hear that creak on the staircase just once when they were alone. I worked at my dining room table until about 9, then tried to watch the end of a movie. Outside, there were occasional silent flashes of lightning in the sky. It was oppressively hot, and we were expecting some thunderstorms, but nothing serious had developed yet. There was a knock at the front door. I almost dropped my scotch. It shocked me so bad. I very reluctantly went to the door and looked through the eye hole. There was a woman outside, mid-30s, looking pallid in the She was dressed frumpily, pretty much swimming in her old clothes since she was so thin and pale, and obviously didn't think much of herself physically. We sat on opposite sofas, and I told her the whole story of the night before, from the beginning. As I went on, she leaned forward and seemed to be riveted to every detail, though she said nothing until the end, when she asked me where my wife had been. So I had to explain about the divorce. Then she asked something strange. If at some point, when I was sitting on the edge of my bed and waiting to see what happened next, I had sensed something outside my bedroom door, if I had felt a presence of some kind. I wanted to say that yes, there had been such a point, almost as if I had been detecting someone out in the hallway, our presences somehow connecting in the lack of sound and light. But I thought it might have just been intense stress and my body preparing me for a possible terrifying confrontation. Karen told me she'd had a similar experience once, but had never told anyone about it. She asked me some questions about Kristen, what I did for a living, and how long I'd been in the area. We talked about the neighborhood. She had just rented a room in a house a couple of months before, wasn't even a homeowner. 20 minutes had gone past since she'd come in, and I offered her a soda or some water, which she accepted. I went into the kitchen to get it for her, and we kept speaking, calling to each other from our respective rooms for a few minutes, while I poured her a Coke and added ice. The last question I called out to her was about what she did for a living, to which there was no response. I assumed she hadn't heard me. I put the rest of the soda back in the fridge and turned to walk back into the living room. Karen was standing in the entryway to the kitchen, smiling at me, strangely. She had raised her hands from her sides up near her head and hooked them into claws, in a weird parody of a monster. She said, "I'm the thing from your hallway," and nothing more. I laughed it off, made some comment about how I wished it had felt that unthreatening. She held that position even then, still grinning like an 8-year-old might when trying to creep up on her sister. It was like she was waiting for me to try to move past or laugh more heartily. But it was far too odd a thing to do that it just struck the wrong chord. I stepped forward and held out her soda glass. She took it, and without a word turned and headed back into the living room. I followed her. Karen didn't sit down again. Instead, she went to the window that looked out at the woods and stood at it. Still no sign of a rainstorm, though those flashes of harmless heat lightning were still happening occasionally. As if continuing a conversation I wasn't aware had even begun, she listed for me the names of the pets she'd had as a child, one by one, as she stared through the window. It was her long question about whether I'd had a problem with animals running through my yard. I hadn't. She told me I probably would sometime. She had often mistaken the sounds of raccoons and even deer for intruders wherever she'd lived, and the woodsiness of this neighborhood meant all sorts of things were running around in the middle of the night. She sympathized with my experience of the night before again and again. I had a casual idea, and I mentioned it to her. I said I'd be glad to give her a ride back home if she'd participate in a little recreation. I was wondering if I took my place inside my bedroom and had her walk up the steps, if I would be reassured that the sound she would make was too different to be what I thought it had been. It was something I genuinely did want to know, even though I already knew the stairs did creak if stepped on the wrong way. It was more a matter of whether the sound could travel that far. She agreed to do this for me, and I was able to use that offer of a ride to telegraph in a subtle way that our conversation had run its course. And so I set my drink down and pointed her to the staircase curving up to the floor above. I don't think I would have made the suggestion if I wasn't a tiny bit drunk. I moved past her, going ahead, and in doing so I noticed something new about her. She was wearing a wig. I could see her hairline. The colors didn't really match. Her natural color was light brown, and the wig was much darker. It didn't mean anything in itself, but I got this sudden, inexplicable image in my mind of Karen standing in front of the window in my living room, but in the dark, and reaching up to adjust that wig as she stared out. What had she been seeing outside that window? I had only been in her presence for 20 minutes, but already I felt I needed to block her out of my life. I told her to come about halfway up the steps and stay there, and I'd call out from my bedroom, and when I did, I'd like her to walk very, very slowly up the steps, just in any detail. A person would have just assumed she should go up the center. I waited for her to say something, but she just showed her yellow teeth in that awful grin. Her skinny fingers held out threateningly, like a monster from a child's primitive nightmare. Why wasn't she asking what I thought? I nervously muttered some thanks, but I found myself unable to walk forward, not until I saw how she reacted. She giggled a little, but didn't lower her hands. I found myself telling her that I had to make a quick phone call, but I'd meet her downstairs in a few minutes, and she could make herself at home. Then I withdrew back into the bedroom and shut the door without waiting for a response. And for no reason I could fully define, I pressed the lock button on the door inwards, just as I had done less than 24 hours ago. I backed up a few steps and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't have my phone with me. It was downstairs, and I'd long been without a landline. I didn't hear the steps creak again, which would have meant Karen was headed back downstairs. I found myself looking at the bottom of the door to detect a change in the shadows underneath it, meaning movement nearby, but it was too dark in the hallway now to do that. What happened then was a change in the air somehow, a thickening, and I sensed fully what Karen had been talking about before. That sense of presence, of connectedness to someone I couldn't see on the other side of the bedroom door. I held my breath and leaned forward, my eyes rooted on the crack under the door. When sound came, I flinched. Karen was twisting the locked doorknob. When she realized she couldn't get in, she spoke. She said she was the thing from the hallway, come to get me. And then she addressed me by a name that was not mine. Not even close. She had me confused with someone else. She told me through the door that if I wouldn't come out, she would come back when I was less bloody. Those were the words she used. Now I heard her moving down the hall. The discrepancy in the volume told me she had tried to be stealthy when she'd approached. Then her footsteps on the stairs, softer now. She was on the carpeting. The worst moment somehow was when I could hear nothing at all. Even though I knew she was far away from me, not knowing her precise location was terrible. But then I thought I could hear the front door open, and I definitely heard it shut, hard. I quickly opened the bedroom door and went to the railing and looked over it, down on the foyer. Though there was nothing there, I didn't yet fully trust Karen was gone. I moved fast the other way and turned the L corner that led to another bedroom and the guest bathroom across from it. Keeping the light off, I went to the window in there, which looked out over the front lawn. And I saw her down there. She was walking down the driveway. She kept going out onto the road. I lived at the end of a cul-de-sac, and there was only one direction she could walk. was more or less fully charged. I slowed my pace a little because I sensed myself pulling a little too close to her, wanting to keep a good 50 yards behind her. On either side of us now were just woods. Maybe, I thought, she would veer off at the last moment and head into them. Maybe she would get to the driveway up ahead and walk around the house up there, where there was a footpath if you went deep enough into the trees, a trail leading north toward a small park. There was a single light on in the house, in an upstairs room, and one car, a minivan parked in the driveway. I stopped where I was, just over the top of the slope that led down toward the house, and I watched Karen go towards it. She never moved faster or slower. There was just no variation in her path or her pace. I registered the fact that she was not wearing her black windbreaker. She must have left it in my house, an awful thought. She walked onto the driveway, past the minivan, and finally turned just to traverse the sidewalk and go up to the front door. She still didn't see me. She knocked on the door, then waited patiently. Someone opened it. It was too dark and too far away to see more than a shape. There seemed to be a conversation, words back and forth, just enough to tell me that Karen certainly didn't know these people. And then, the person in the doorway stepped back and let her inside. The front door closed, and I was utterly alone on the street. I called the police then, still feeling uneasy about it, and unsure what I would be accusing this woman of, but the feeling I had in the pit of my stomach was undeniable. apologized in advance if I was overreacting, and very briefly told him a sketch version of the story. He said he would just make sure everything was okay in there, and that I could wait at the curb. I prepared myself for mortal embarrassment, but was almost hoping for it now. The officer went up to the front door, making some comment into the tiny mic attachment on his shoulder, and knocked. No answer for what seemed like almost a half minute. Instead of knocking again, he turned the knob and pushed the door inward, just enough to poke his head in. I heard him call out a hello, but I didn't hear any response. He moved completely into the house, not quite shutting the door behind him all the way. There was a point at which I just couldn't stay by the curb anymore, because he'd been in there too long. Too long. It couldn't be that nothing should change in 8 minutes, 10 minutes. I made up my mind. I crossed the lawn and went up to the door, which was still partially ajar. Poked my head in, listened. Silence. I moved into the dark foyer. Like my house, this one had a big sunken living room to the right, a staircase to the left. The only light was coming from an upstairs hallway that was hidden by the twist of the stairs. That light was the only one I myself left on when I went to bed every night, so that intruders might think someone was awake up above and not vulnerable. There was not a sound, not until a burst of digital noise from above and the voice of the police officer speaking into his radio, words I couldn't make out. Then, the thump of heavy feet descending the stairs, fast, too fast. Before I could even backpedal in fear, he appeared, his gun held outward, ready to shoot to kill, lowering it only a little after determining in a split second that I was not the one in the house who would harm him. Until the other authorities arrived, it was just that man and me in those thick, deep woods behind that house, he not allowing me more than a few yards from his side, as we tried to spot a single shadow in all that darkness. It was only 5 minutes until the assistance came, lots of it, and I was pulled away from the chaos to be made safe and begin to answer all the questions they had for me. When I first saw the crime scene photographs in the courtroom months later, my first thought was how lucky I'd been that night not to make even the slightest ascent up the staircase and see the bloodstains that began just beyond my view from the foyer. It was horrible enough that when the police finally left my home at 3 in the morning, I realized I'd completely forgotten to mention the black windbreaker draped over my sofa. The one that belonged to that intruder, that deeply deranged killer who'd lived less than half her life outside a mental hospital. It was an accidental souvenir